to this edition of Blitzkrieg. This is Remlace from 40k Theories, and joining me is Fiora the Tank Girl as we explore in this episode the tanks and heavy armor of the Imperium of Mankind.
Hello everyone, I'm Fiora, and we are looking at, I believe, the Baneblade first?
That is correct. Now, the Baneblade is the main super heavy tank of the Imperial Guard. It is, for those of you who don't know, it is an absolutely massive beast of a tank. It's crewed by a commander, a driver, 3 gunners, 3 ammunition loaders, a comms operator, and an engineer, and it weighs in at a staggering 319 tons.
Good God, wait, 319 tons? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, wow. That is taking some effort there.
Yes.
But of course it has the problem of it only does 25 kph on the road, 18 off-road, so it's very slow. And they try to make up for this by making the armor incredibly thick.
Just how thick is the armor?
It is 210 millimeters of space age composite, which to equate that, an M1 Abrams on paper supposedly only boasts 155 millimeters of frontal armor.
So this thing can evidently take quite a pounding from enemy fire.
In theory.
In theory.
Assuming that you're up against regular troops and not veteran troops, yeah, you would probably take a significant pounding. Not to mention the fact that while the side armor says it might be 160 mil thick, and I'm kind of guessing at this, the tracks and the side skirt over the tracks looks like it's thicker than a person. So you're talking an extra. The side armor might actually be thicker than the front. But that's not to say you can't hurt it. There are a lot of. If you actually look below the turret, there's quite a few vision ports. Those are always structural weak points in a tank. And the other issue with it is the lack of sloping on the various turrets it has. So they have these very flat sides and very flat fronts with a thick gun mantle, but that means that if the turret's not looking directly at a target that's shooting back at it, it's likely to get penetrated.
And there's also the question of maneuverability as well. A tank this size, it's not going to be effective at dodging incoming fire at all, really, is it? I mean, a tank hunter like the Leman Russ Vanquisher would have a pretty good odds of being able to damage or even destroying it, really, to be honest.
Yeah, it would. The tank, like I said, the top speed is 25 kph. To put this into modern terms, hell, put it in World War II terms, a Tiger 1 did 32 kph, and it was considered slow. So what you're going to have is you're relying on the armor, because you're sacrificing 2 aspects of a tank, which are, the 4 aspects are speed, armor, firepower, and stealth. Well, it doesn't have speed or maneuverability, and it most certainly is not a stealthy vehicle.
Unless the army's being commanded by Creed, because he can make anything stealthy.
Apparently. I don't know how you would make a Baneblade stealthy, but if you can do it, you know what? More power to you.
Creed can do it. He can make a Warhound Titan stealthy. He just make it somehow hide behind a bush. He's able to do it. He's just that good.
Now, the other problem I have with the Baneblade is I actually have a picture of its internals. And all of the ammunition is located in the center of the tank. This is something that we avoid doing at all costs, because we find it now, this might be completely different for the Imperium, but we find it easier to replace the vehicle than we do the experience of the crew. So we put the ammunition towards the outside where it has a cellular ammunition storage, so if the ammo gets hit, it blows out a panel and blows outside, and the ammunition fire goes outside the tank and doesn't kill anybody inside. This, if you hit an ammunition rack and it goes off, it's gonna blow up the entire tank from the inside out. It'll be like a pressured oxygen tank getting hit with a high caliber round. It's gonna make the tank basically explode outward.
but presumably being able to take a few things with it along the way, with an explosion that large from a tank that big.
We would hope it takes the enemy with them.
That's all the Imperium would care about. Screw your troops, as long as the enemy's dead, that's all that matters.
The other issue with locating the ammunition in the center, while it does give the ammunition the most protection against incoming fire, it means your loaders are running back and forth constantly. That doesn't affect the las cannon turrets, obviously, but the heavy bolters, the demolisher cannon, the Baneblade cannon, the auto cannons, all of those have to be manually fed ammunition once the belts run out. And that means the loader's having to run that extra distance, so you're slowing down your reload speed and you're wearing out your crew faster.
So let's just take a quick look again at the armament of this tank. The primary armament being the Baneblade cannon and the Demolisher cannon, which are absolutely perfect for destroying fortifications and even other tanks. These are essentially, in a way, tanks that can take on pretty much anything as long as they can survive relying on their armor. And with the secondary armament of an autocannon, 2 las cannons, and 6 heavy bolters, it's going to be pretty effective against damn near anything that it can go up against, as long as it can rely on that heavy armor protecting it.
Absolutely, and it does have one massive advantage, and that is the if you look at the picture of a Baneblade, on the right side of the Baneblade cannon is another, what looks like a gun. It actually is a gun. It's an auto cannon used for range finding. So they're not going to be wasting their Baneblade cannon shots until that autocannon is hitting a target. Basically, it's the engineer's way of saying, well, here's another gun that you need to use to make sure that you're actually going to hit what you're shooting at. And that's incredibly useful, but then you run into the problem, the same problem that the Japanese had with sponson turrets, and the same problem the Russians had with sponson turrets. You lose your ability to depress the gun. So when we talk about gun depression, we're talking about a gun going down, pointing downward. And since this thing is probably, I would say, how tall is this? 6.3 meters. Okay, so it's 3 people tall, effectively. Because average height is between 1.9 and 2.1 meters.
Yeah, with a ground clearance of 1.2 meters.
So you're talking 7.5 meters for it to shoot the ground. With only 2 degrees of depression, if you look under the elevation, it says -2, with only 2 degrees. That means anything within 50 meters that is not 7.5 meters tall is going to be too short for it to shoot with its main gun. That is a big dead zone. And so I could really see these things getting knocked out by infantry who ambush it.
So things such as the Orc Tankbuster Boys or Eldar Fire Dragons, for example.
Exactly. You sit in a city building, you make sure everybody keeps their head down until the last possible moment, and then opens up with anti-tank guns into the sides and rear of the tank. Which, while I don't imagine that the sides are going to get penetrated by infantry weapons, I could definitely see the rear getting pinned by an infantry weapon, because the rear is completely flat. Even if it has the same armor of 190 mil that's on the front of the hull, it's still completely flat, so it's a perfect target for impact, and if you knock out the engine of a tank, it's basically useless.
Absolutely.
However, the thing I really think that this makes this thing work is intimidation factor. I don't care who you are, unless you're talking veteran troops. If a Baneblade turns all its guns in your general direction, the only 2 things you're going to do are either run or find cover.
Well, the third option being you shit your pants.
I could totally see an Eldar commander going, "Bring me my brown pants." That's most of what I have to say about the Baneblade. But I am going to point out one very interesting structural weak point on the front of the tank. Right there at the front, just past the Demolisher cannon, is just this flat lower plate. Now, we as engineers have constantly removed armor from the lower plate of tanks because we assume it's not going to get hit or it's easy to hide. and this is so the tanks can go faster. The Germans ended up paying for this significantly because, like, on a Tiger 1, the upper hull was 100 millimeters thick, but the lower hull was only 60. And once the Russians figured this out, they just had, people shoot into that lower plate and destroy the transmission over and over again. Well, here, it's flat. And I'm going to assume that, like us, to make it go faster, the lower plate's thinner.
It makes sense.
To this, there's no front idler wheel track guard. And the easiest way to destroy a tank's mobility is to blow off the idler or the power wheel. The idler wheel is usually located on the front. It's just there to keep the track moving. That's why you have like guards that go over them, is to hide them. Even, I hate to be mean about this, even a heavy bolter might have a chance of destroying a track because it's so exposed.
And bear in mind,
that's not good.
And bear in mind, heavy bolters aren't exactly, even though a lot of people equate them to, like, a belt-fed, heavy machine gun.
No.
They're firing bolt rounds. Bolt rounds are mass reactive explosive shells. In essence, they're miniature missiles.
It's a miniature high velocity grenade launcher.
Yeah.
I mean, the specs I've seen on a bolter say that it's 30 to 45 millimeters. That's a grenade. And that's why when you see like an Imperial Guard model with one, he's like got his arm as far out as possible to get it around the trigger, and his other arm is off to the side because it's huge. Whereas the Space Marine's obviously able to carry it easier. But those are kind of the weaknesses and strengths of this thing. I couldn't see our modern military using them simply because we have this theory that speed kills. But I could see the Imperium using them because they have a theory of firepower kills.
Yeah.
So I believe the Land Raider is the next one.
Yes. The standard pattern Land Raider, the Land Raider Phobos, which is the heavy artillery / heavy transport of the Adeptus Astartes, capable of carrying a full 10-man squad of Marines and power armor, or a 5-man squad and Terminator armor, with a standard armament of dual heavy bolters and 2 twin-linked las cannons on side sponsons. Weighing in at 72 tons, it's a lot lighter than the Baneblade. It's also a lot smaller. It's also actually a lot faster as well, with an off-road speed of 48 kilometers an hour.
Well, it's a lot faster, and the armor's not bad. 95 millimeters on something that's only half the weight of the Baneblade, I would imagine would be pretty good. The twin-linked bolter, I don't know if I believe this depression figure, because while yes, you might in theory be able to depress at 32 degrees, I'm pretty sure at about 15-16 degrees you're going to be shooting yourself. So maybe you can do it, but I'm pretty sure you'd be shooting your own armor. The las cannons on the secondary side sponsons on these actually do not strip away armor like sponson turrets we tried on previous vehicles, because they're completely external. It's like a helicopter mounted weapon pod. It's a external component that if you shoot it, it's not going to make a big deal to the vehicle itself. It might knock out the gun, but the crew's not going to care because they're still alive. And unlike the Rhino, there's only one forward driver vision port, which means that there's only one really obvious weak point on the front of this thing that I can see anyway. It looks like this, I would say, is a very, very solid vehicle. Simply because you have excellent armor sloping on the front. The sides, while they don't have the best armor slope, while they have no armor sloping on the sides, you have to remember that the sides are mostly tracks. And then on top of that, the side sponsons are actually adding a layer of armor to it. In addition to this, the fact it carries 10 Space Marines would just terrify most people to even have to encounter that.
It'd be more terrifying if it was carrying a 5-man Terminator assault squadron and it was bearing down at you at high speed.
Now, the defect with this vehicle is the number of doors. You have a door on the front, you have doors on the back, and you have doors on the side. And every one of those big doors has to be able to open and close, and that creates inherent weak points, because when you need to open and close a door, that means you have hinges, you have a door frame. It's basically, you have the main armor sheeting, and then you have a door or a hatch. Well, the door or a hatch doesn't have that main armor sheeting and main internal structural support pressing out against it. So what I imagine that they probably have done here is that the doors are double doors. And the reason for this is so infantry anti-tank weapons have less of a chance of actually hurting you. Since most infantry anti-tank weapons work on the concept of a heat round, which is a shape charge that detonates and shoots a jet of plasma into the armor, focused at one point, trying to penetrate the armor with superheated metal. What happens if you have space between, if you penetrate one layer of armor and then there's another layer but there's a space between it, that plasma gets exposed to open air and cools significantly. Something like for every millimeter of plasma travels through air, it loses 10 millimeters of penetration. So I'm really thinking they probably have two doors here, or they have a single door that actually is two doors together with a space in between it, so it compensates against infantry weapons. But that's the only structural weak point I can see here, is the doors. Other than that, this to me is a very, very solid armored vehicle. It has amazing sloping. All of the tracks are almost completely covered. None of the tread wheels are exposed. The only problem I can see is maintenance, because I could imagine it as a pain to replace tracks on a Land Raider. A pain. And I can imagine it's also a pain to get out and have to tighten or loosen the tracks after travel.
That is what the Tech Priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus are for.
Exactly.
Space Marines do not need to worry themselves about that, apart from a Tech Marine, but that's what Servitors are for as well.
That's what Servitors are for. We're not the Imperial Guard. We don't maintenance our own vehicles. The only variant of the Land Raider I have an issue with is actually the Crusader variant. And that's because the sponsons are located behind the side doors. So if somebody forgets to tell their friends that they're getting out at the moment, or somebody's a little carried away about shooting, then basically your own Marines are going to step directly into the sponson turret's fire as they exit the vehicle. And I could see a fair number of, quote, accidents happening if the crew doesn't get told, hey, stop shooting for 2 seconds.
Yes. But speaking of the crew, Land Raider Phobos only has 2 crew, and that's a driver and a commander. That's it.
Yeah, I thought about this for a little bit, and then realized that the passengers are probably the ones who primarily man the guns, and then when there's no passengers, the commander has computerized gun sights in front of him and is controlling all the guns. The issue with that being is that when the commander is controlling all the guns manually, it can only fire at one target, because, or maybe 2 targets, because he's not going to be able to split his attention aiming at multiple enemies at once. I'm really wondering though what happens when one of these things does get penetrated, because I haven't found any pictures of the inside of one of these, and I'm wondering, when you have 12 bolters strapped to the side of a Land Raider Crusader, where's all that ammunition kept? Where's the fuel kept? Is the engine in the back, in the front? Because I can't tell where the engine is, since you have doors that go in and out of it from every direction. So I'm wondering if, like, the guy sitting on top of the tank is also sitting on the engine as it's running.
Would that be something that they would use in tanks today? I mean, I don't know much about modern day armor.
Modern day tanks, universally, we put the engine in the back. We know if the engine gets hit, there's a lot of things that can go wrong if the engine gets hit. It can catch fire. It can if it shuts down, the tank, only the batteries of the tank will power the turret, and at that point, once the battery runs out, the tank is completely vulnerable to any attack. If the engine gets hit in precisely the wrong way, it might superheat the metal and then send fragments everywhere, which a high velocity sabot round sending fragments everywhere inside of a vehicle that also happen to be superheated is basically the meat salad effect of a tank. Everyone inside is probably dead. And we also know that the engine is the most delicate piece of the machinery in the tank. For instance, if the cannon breech gets hit, you can clear the cannon breech, and so long as the firing mechanism is intact, the gun will still fire. You can't fix an engine in the field if it gets hit. So that's why I'm wondering where that engine's located, because I would imagine it might be located in the center, or it might be located in the off to the side in the rear if it's small enough. But I really don't know, for looking from the outside in.
Okay.
Which I guess would be an advantage, because if I don't know where it is, I imagine somebody trying to shoot it with a las cannon's not going to know where to hit the engine either.
Unless they use Land Raiders themselves, they're probably not going to have the experience of trying to find a weak point, that that delicate piece to pinpoint. So really, the only armies who would have a chance to know it would be other Space Marine legions, the Chaos Space Marine legions, possibly the Orcs, because they are known to loot damaged Land Raiders off the battlefield.
Oh. I've heard a story about Orc Leman Russ that they kept knocking out. And they thought for one day for sure it wasn't coming back because they hit it with a las destroyer. Comes back the next day and still fighting them with this same tank.
Here we go, here we go, here we go, as the Orcs were known to chant.
So eventually they knock it out and capture it, and they go, alright, what is making this thing work? And they open it up, and inside there's no engine. There's a drawing of an engine that says vroom vroom. And I just went, no, bad Orcs.
That's the thing, though, that could be possible. Orcs, all Orc technology is powered basically by them believing in it. But that's a topic for another day.
That's true.
So, moving on, we'll be moving on to the standard issue Mars Pattern Rhino, which also has a lot of variants, as the chassis forms the basis of several other Imperial tanks. Now, standard Mars Pattern Rhino is your basic armoured personnel carrier used by the Space Marines. It's not big enough to carry Terminators, but it can carry a full 10-man tactical squad. General armament is really only a pintle-mounted storm bolter. It weighs in about 30 tons and has an off-road speed of 55 kilometers an hour.
Reading this and all the different variants of it, which we're going to get to, this is like a universal weapons platform. In its stock state, which is what the Rhino is, it's just an armored personnel carrier. The armor on the front is sloped. It doesn't have the best sloping angle that I think they could get out of it, but I'm also thinking that because of the bulk of the power armor for the guys who are driving this thing, they kind of had to make a concession here. The thing I'm wondering is why it has 2 vision ports if it only has 1 driver. Are they trying to design it more like a car where a person sits in the center and then looks out each port, or what's going on there?
There are some variants that only have 1 vision port. I think it possibly depends on what pattern Rhino it actually is. For example, what Forge World is producing it. But the whole... I think the reason for 2 vision systems might be just so that the driver can get a better degree of vision. It's like essentially some peripheral vision as well.
Well, you have to remember that anytime an engineer adds a vision port, they have to have a really good reason, because that's a structural weak point. Any direct armor-piercing shell that hits a vision port is probably going through. And if you get a shaped charge shooting plasma at a vision port, obviously that doesn't matter that it's going through the open air. It's basically penetrated the tank for free. So in the case of a Rhino, I'm really wondering what that second vision port is for. It might actually be for the people who it's carrying, but since I see it on Predators and Whirlwinds, I'm kind of skeptical on what its purpose is. The lower plate of this one I see also has a reinforcing plate. Basically, they put applique armor over it, which is where like the Space Marine insignia goes. Excellent design choice. You're reinforcing what would normally be a structural weak point where you have to flatten the armor and then pattern it underneath the tank so that you have a bottom. So that it also means that when this thing strikes a mine, because most of the time when you hit an anti-tank mine, you hit it with the front of the tank, it's less likely to actually be destroyed. And there's not a lot to say about the APC version.
Okay, so let's move on to the Vindicator variant of the Rhino, which is a siege variant armed with a large demolition cannon, which is a cannon that fires rocket-propelled high-explosive shells, which is basically designed to bring down entire buildings.
Now this, I can totally see the Sturm Tiger being the inspiration for it, because the Sturm Tiger carried a very similar 310mm weapon. They also, I see a lot of these Vindicators that add this huge dozer plate to the front of it. Basically meaning that you've really up-armored this thing so that the front is almost indestructible.
Sorry, carry on.
The thing I'm wondering, though, is why it doesn't lose a lot of speed. Do Space Marines weigh more than a Vindicator cannon in that giant dozer blade?
Considering that dozer blade, I would assume would be pretty damn thick, because not only is it acting as extra armor, it's also being used to like push rubble from wall to destroy buildings out the way. And bear in mind, the Vindicator cannon is an extremely large cannon. Like, it's massive. So I think all the weight will probably be just, I don't know, maybe it's all the extra weight is, keeping the firing mechanism bolted in place or whatever, so it doesn't, like flip the tank or something like that.
Now, the weakness to this is the gun depression, is 0 degrees. So if a Vindicator is having to shoot a target that's below it, it can't. It physically can't. It has to move in such a way as to get the tank to be pointed on a downward slope and then use its elevation, which is massive, 45 degrees, as its depression angles. So if you can get underneath it, you're basically kind of immune to its fire until they, realize you're down there and try to get into a very awkward position to shoot you, which something to remember anytime that you're doing the technique for my vocabulary is actually what's called reverse elevation, where you're basically pointing the tank down in order to use the elevation for your depression. When you do that, you're exposing the top armor, which means most vehicles in our modern day, their top armor is only as thick as their rear, because we assume that they're not going to get hit by a direct hit from above. That's changed recently with, guided missiles and helicopter attacks, but that's only a recent change. So I'm kind of wondering how a Vindicator commander would compensate for that. The fact he knows that his massive death cannon is not useful if somebody's underneath him. What are they training to do to get around that? Or are they just, using the bulldozer and just shoving rubble towards the enemy and hoping that between the bulldozer and the rubble they can't be penetrated until they get their gun on them?
Well, one of the Vindicator does have two optional additional weapons. One being the pintle-mounted Storm Bolter, which is, good for clearing light infantry that get too close. Um, but it's also known for carrying a hunter-killer missile launcher, which is kind of like a heat-seeking missile launcher.
So,
And it can be equipped with smoke launchers as well to distract any enemy and potentially camouflage it against dense rubble and dust that be kicked up from destroyed buildings.
curious question. Because this would be important for tanks. Is the hunter killer guided by a heat signature, a laser designator, a wire, or radar?
The hunter killer has an onboard cogitator and uses sensors located in the nose cap to find its target.
Oh, so it's a semi-artificial intelligence that is looking for a target.
In essence, yes. Guided by a
impressive.
machine spirit.
That seems a little excessive for missile guidance, but that's impressive. So I would imagine that anybody who's driving a Vindicator would be more than happy to have a hunter-killer missile attached to it to shoot at tanks, or a storm bolter attached to it for the guy on top to poke out and go, okay, nope, you are not getting close to us right now.
Insert Samuel L. Jackson quote here. Okay.
I'm tired of these orcs in this city.
So, Stormbar, we need to clear every single motherfucker in the room. Okay, so let's move on to another variant on the Rhino chassis, the Whirlwind, which is an artillery support vehicle armed with 2 Whirlwind missile launchers. Now, these missile launchers can be armed with a variety of missiles, including your standard high explosive missile warheads, missiles known as Castellan missiles, which are equipped with warheads that can be set to explode at specific times and altitudes to scatter small mine-like bombs across a designated target area, incendiary missiles, and flak missiles. So these warheads are actually quite adaptable in the battlefield situation.
I'm imagining that anybody with any sense, when you load one of these things, is going to load every single type of missile. Because the Rhino is, as I said, seems like a universal weapons carrier. You can just mount whatever you want on it and go with it. And the Whirlwind would be no exception. I would seriously consider mounting every single type of missile into the launcher, and then having the gunner just pick what fires and when. The advantage, of course, being that because they're missiles, and because he obviously has some way of guiding them, I'm assuming laser designation would be the easiest method. He doesn't have to, it doesn't need depression. So a 0-degree depression's fine because you have a guided missile. You can, if something's so close that the missile can't just physically turn and arc down, you can fire it off into the air and then point it at the target so it has time to turn around and come back. And 60 missiles, I don't see a reason not to carry every single armament you possibly can. Not to mention that it's still doing 68 kph, which is impressive. To gain 3 tons of weight onto a Rhino and then it still does almost all of its speed is pretty impressive. The defect here I'm seeing is the armor on the turret. 30mm, half the armor of the hull. And in armor and tank and armored warfare, the turret is often the most exposed part and the area of the vehicle that shot the most. So having half the armor is not very good. I could totally see. Now, they are missiles, so they're not actually armed until they're fired. But it's still a high explosive, so if you happen to hit one of the high explosive missiles, I could see the entire turret just exploding. And that would be really bad.
Yeah.
And it still has that same... I'm imagining now the second viewport on the Rhino is for the gunner, since you have a driver and a gunner. And that the hatch is where the gunner is, so he can look through the ports of the hatch as well. But You also still have that double forward vision port, which is another weak point. But other than that, again, incredibly well sloped, very nice applique armor over the lower plate. The tracks are completely protected from any incoming fire, and they even appear, now that I'm looking at a Dark Angels version where I can see the paint better, they even appear to have applied applique armor around the door to make sure that the door actually has additional reinforcing as well on the sides of the Whirlwind. So I'm not seeing a lot of structural weakness beyond the fact that the turret is basically screaming, "Shoot me."
True. But at the same time, a Whirlwind on a battlefield position would be, I would imagine, being situated very far back rather than being on the front lines.
You would definitely want it very far back, and I'm guessing they have some sort of smoke grenades or some sort of EW package to help prevent counter battery fire. Or considering that it does 68 kph, it's probably firing off 1-2 shots and then getting the hell out of dodge before anybody can fire off some counter battery rounds.
And again, like other variants of the Rhino, it can also be equipped with a pintle-mounted storm bolter, smoke launchers, and again a hunter-killer missile launcher. So if you haven't got enough missiles, have another missile.
Do you want more missile DACA? Here you go. Here's more missile DACA. Have fun. But I could... This would be the vehicle that I would see... when the call came to withdraw, this would be the vehicle at like the... going full speed with the turret turned around, just flinging missile shot after missile shot to try to delay the enemy advance. So you would not actually probably ever get to use your hunter killer or your storm or your bolters that you have mounted. You wouldn't want to. You would want to just keep firing missiles until you were out of ammunition.
Could you potentially use a Whirlwind in an offensive position, like just like surging forward, suppressing fire, all of these missiles, driving the enemy back while you advance, launching all these missiles after missiles after missiles into the enemy lines?
In a situation in which I know the enemy lacks anti-tank capability, yes. Even 30 millimeters of composite armor is still going to block small arms fire. And if it's in a situation in which I know for a fact the enemy does not have something powerful enough to actually hurt the turret, yeah, I would totally just use these as... If you're talking about like a hive uprising, then yeah, just roll rhinos at it, firing the canister shot rounds, or the Castilla missiles, where they're just gonna send out clusters of little bomblets everywhere. You'd suppress a hive uprising in a day, because their auto pistols obviously are gonna do absolutely nothing, and one of those missiles is gonna break apart a whole building worth of insurgents.
Until you find out the Hive Insurgency is a Gene Stealer cult, and there's a whole bunch of pure strain Gene Stealers running around as well, using their massive claws to tear holes in your armor. If they can rip a Terminator to shreds with ease, they can probably tear open tank armor pretty easily as well.
Yeah, but
the issue is getting close.
I think the Gene Stealer's gonna want to, because I could see as a tactic, if you have like somebody trying to tear into the tank with a power claw, or a Gene Stealer with one of its talons, you fire the missile up far enough away from the tank it can turn around, and then put the designator on your own armor. Because a high explosive warhead is not going to really have a good chance of actually hurting you, but it sure is going to shred the guy trying to tear into you with a melee weapon. And this is the Imperium. I'm pretty sure the Space Marines are crazy enough to shoot themselves in order to kill the enemy.
Yeah, I can see that.
Or
at the same time, would they risk wanting to damage one of their own weapons just in case?
Or if you really wanted to make this a truly terrifying weapon, and this is something that the Soviets learned with their external fuel tanks. Yeah, if the outside of the tank's on fire, that's kind of bad, but who cares? It's on the outside. So instead of a high explosive round, set yourself on fire with one of the incendiary missiles. Nobody's going to want to close into melee if you're on fire, but at the same time, you don't really care. It's on the outside. It's kind of like if you coat a modern battle tank in napalm. Well, yeah, it's going to set off the explosive reactive armor, but other than that, the crew inside is perfectly happy. They're in an air-conditioned, environmentally controlled vehicle. They just wait for the fire to go out.
In essence, it's bad bonfire for us, but it's even worse for them.
So, if you're talking about using this for high rebellion suppression, it turns out there's gene stealers in the formation. I could see the order coming down: set your tanks on fire, and then just watching the expression on a gene stealer's face when he goes, "You've got to be kidding me."
So moving on to the more offensively inclined variant of the Rhino chassis, the Predator. Now we'll be looking at the Predator Destructor, which is the standard issue Predator, armed with a turret-mounted autocannon, and a variant in the Sponson sidearms are either heavy bolters or las cannons. So again, this can be tailored to. Well, it can be tailored to come against a variety of situations. You can use the heavy bolters as more of an anti-infantry role, in essence, or light armored vehicles, or las cannon if you want to go purely for armor hunting.
This thing is kind of scary. It's the same Rhino chassis. There's no armor improvement, so obviously the armor of the Rhino is good enough. It's almost double the weight of the Rhino, but it's still the same speed. So they had to really, really upgrade that engine to maintain that forward momentum. On top of this, because of the way the sponsons are mounted, they're directly covering the side doors, which means that they basically added 50, 60 millimeters of side applique armor over those doors, making it almost removing them as a weak point altogether, and now making that a weapon. Again, you have the very nice applique. The extra layer of armor, when I say applique, is when you basically take steel plates and slap them over already existing structure over the front lower hull to prevent the lower hull from being a weakness. You still have that double vision port on all the models I've seen, which I don't necessarily agree with, again, because vision ports are weak points. The weird part to me here, though, is that it only has 2 crew.
A driver and a gunner.
So for that to happen, that means all of the weapons on this tank are auto-loaded, so they're automatically fed ammunition. So there's no need for a loader. And then on our normal tanks, we have a commander. And the reason we have that commander is for coordination purposes between the other 3 crewmen. So the commander has to be aware of everything the tank is doing, and then he tells the driver, do this. He tells the gunner where the targets are, and the gunner and him and he relays to the loader what type of ammunition to be loaded for the target. And they don't have that. So I'm wondering if that's because they're Space Marines and therefore superhuman and don't need it, or if there's something else going on here, that maybe the driver and gunner are literally directly next to each other and can coordinate that way, i.e. there's no one actually in the turret. Which, considering how small the turret is on top, I could see it being a personless turret, similar to the T-14 Armada concept coming out of Russia, where the turret has nobody in it, and everything is operated independently. Now, there are flaws with this. The first one is because you're using an auto-loading mechanism, if that auto-loading mechanism is damaged, the gun's useless. And you can't put somebody in there to replace the auto-loading mechanism because there wouldn't be any space. The second defect with this is that the ammunition is located directly next to the gun, and in the event that something penetrates near the gun, because the way that vision works, and therefore the way that most people who rely on vision works, is that when you see shiny flashy, you shoot at shiny flashy, particularly during night fighting. So the guns are going to get probably the most rounds flung at them of all on all of these vehicles. So when a round penetrates and the ammunition's located right next to the gun, you can imagine that would be very bad if the ammunition suddenly decides, I'm going to cook off right now.
Yeah, definitely.
Other than that, this really looks like they just took a lot of extra armor and slapped it on here and then put a turret on. And I will give credit to the designers who understand how tanks work, and that is that turrets are freaking heavy. And all the mechanisms that connect an independently rotating turret to a tank are amazingly heavy. Because this over doubles the weight of the Rhino. The only problem I can see is because of the location of the sponson turrets. You do have 15 degrees of depression off the front of the tank. I could see that. I don't see you still having 15 degrees of depression off the side of the tank, and that's simply because of where the sponson bars are. You're going to be hitting the gun against the sponson bar when you're pointed off the side of the turret, the side of the tank. So if something's beside you, the main turret will have issues engaging it. Then again, it's 6.6 meters tall with a ground clearance of, oh my god, you have to really suck in your stomach to get under this thing. Which is not the best thing. Now that I think about it, half a meter of ground clearance is about 1.5 feet. That means that's a problem against mines, which I could now understand why they added all the extra application armor to the front. Is because when you have a smaller ground clearance, there's a point where getting too little ground clearance means that, first off, it's going to be really hard to go up and over bumps and hills because you might get high-centered, which, if a tank's high-centered, you basically have to have another tank shove it off. The other issue is that it creates a compression area for an explosive from underneath the tank. The smaller the space, the more compression, therefore the more force that explosive will have against the armor of the hull. So I would say they probably would want to increase the ground clearance by maybe 1/4 meter to get enough that a person can fit under there reasonably easily, to make sure that, one, if you run over something, you're not going to get stuck on it, and two, a mine isn't going to have as much compression when it goes off.
But with the additional option of having the bulldozer blade, would that help compensate against any potential mines it might come across?
The bulldozer blade would compensate not only against mines, it would also prevent high centering because it would push anything out of the way of the center of the tank. One of the most common issues that we have with tanks, particularly in, if you want to take it from a video game perspective, even War Thunder, when you run over like a car, like a person's car, because a tank is huge, you can get stuck on it. Or when a tank has an ammunition rack cook off, the turret usually blows off the tank several dozen meters away. And if the driver's not paying attention and drives over that turret, the tank will just be sitting up there on that turret and unable to move because it's high centered. A bulldozer blade completely changes this. It means you're likely going to clear the mine on the way in, and it's going to blow up on the blade. And also, you're not going to get stuck. There's no way you're going to get stuck because anything that you would get stuck on gets shoved out of the way. And if it doesn't get shoved out of the way, well, you back up and go around it.
Okay, so we're going to leave it there for Space Marine vehicles. But we're going to quickly jump back into the Imperial Guard.